Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Global Agenda at the University of Delaware. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. Global Agenda is supported by the University of Delaware's Institute for Global Studies, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the Department of Communication. Thank you all for coming this evening. Around the world, and especially in Africa and the developing world, the United States is known for our generosity. When disaster strikes, whether a tsunami in South Asia, AIDS medicine in Southern Africa, or a famine in Somalia, the U.S. is respected for helping. As we'll hear, I'm sure, from our speaker tonight, when it comes to sharing technology, from equipment for healthcare to water supplies, mining, or commerce, the U.S. is seen as a leader in Africa and elsewhere in the world. But the United States has another face in Africa and the developing world. Our energy companies extract fuel and minerals for the industrialized world from the continent of Africa. We invest in countries which supply our needs. But those investments don't always find their way to the people of Africa, who could use better roads and hospitals, more schools, more electricity, better paying jobs, and so on. History documents that American and other Western investments in Africa have often lined the pockets and the European bank accounts of undemocratic leaders and have supported brutal dictatorships throughout the continent. Our speaker tonight, Dr. CIDRZ Mwanza, who is from Zambia, where the recent spike in the worldwide demand for copper has helped to boost the economy, will help enlighten us on all this. Zambia is an example of a place where continuing AIDS and high birth rates, high unemployment, and regressive government policies keep most people living in poverty. Zambia is a country whose population is over 14 million, of whom just 800,000, I read and researched, have internet access, although I think maybe our speaker will dispute that number. It's a fact that relates to our speaker's current work tonight. Dr. Mwanza is the founder of a technology company focused on harnessing the mobile phone rather than the internet as a vehicle for financial services. In 2012, the U.S. government awarded her company an innovation award for a micro-insurance product sold on the mobile phone. She's on the board of a copper mining company, an asset management firm, and an HIV/AIDS non-governmental organization that provides care and treatment programs in several African countries. Between 2005 and 2009, Dr. Mwanza was Chief Operations Officer for the Center for Infectious Disease Research in Zambia, the largest HIV/AIDS nonprofit organization in Africa. She oversaw almost 600 employees and managed a $30 million annual budget of U.S. government and privately donated funds. She's also worked at the World Bank and holds a PhD in international relations from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and law degrees from the University of Zambia and from Cornell University. Please welcome CIDRZ Mwanza to the University of Delaware.
Good evening. I'd like to thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. I'm very excited, and I'd like to thank you all for showing up and taking time out of your busy schedule. I genuinely appreciate you being here. In international relations, we obsess about power. Who's gaining power, who's losing power, and why. Whether you view the international society as fundamentally anarchical or fundamentally cooperative or peaceful, it's clear that countries small and large jostle for power positions, and we can see this with North Korea today. The US is undoubtedly the most powerful in the constellation of states, both economically and politically. The question now is if and how the US can maintain its #1 status against a rising China. The answer to this question includes an assessment about America's ability to maintain its influence over other countries in the international system. Turning to our focus today, Africa, America influences the continent in many ways, culturally, ideologically, politically, and economically. For this talk, I will focus on politics and economics and talk a little bit about ideology towards the end. The effort to exert influence in Africa has been primarily through aid. US aid to the continent has come in 4 major waves. The first wave was after the colonial era. In the late 50s and early 60s, when most African countries gained independence, for former colonial powers, it was a way of them maintaining influence over their ex-colonies. For the US, it was used as a carrot to lure allies in the Cold War away from the USSR. And the USSR was doing exactly the same thing. Because aid was based on strategic calculations in the context of the Cold War, it was divorced from considerations of internal politics and from development outcomes. As Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, said, the primary reason that there's little to show for more than 300 billion of aid that has gone to Africa is that in the context of the Cold War, geopolitical and strategic rivalries and economic interests, much of the aid was spent on creating and sustaining client regimes of one type or other, with minimal regard to development outcomes on the continent. As a consequence of the Cold War, the US supported some diabolical individuals and regimes, from Mobutu Sese Seko of then Zaire, now the DRC, Idi Amin in Uganda, Samuel Doe in Liberia, to name a few of the most notorious. After the end of the Cold War, there was an overall reduction in US aid. However, a new rationale for aid was found and promulgated, and this was under what I call the second wave of aid, which was support for human rights and economic reforms, with generally more emphasis on economic reforms. Not surprisingly, some African countries that had been winners during the Cold War had their aid dramatically cut. This policy shift in Washington forced aid recipients to liberalize their economies. The reform package, the so-called Washington Consensus, meant dramatic changes from state-centric or state-run economies toward free market economies. Aid policy was reinforced by structural adjustment programs under the auspices of the World Bank and the IMF. Together, bilateral donors, such as the US, and multilaterals, such as the IMF and the World Bank, pushed policies of trade liberalization, privatization of public companies, the end or reduction of subsidies, and shrinking civil services. By the 1990s, as the second wave was not yielding results, some of you will recall the 50 years is enough campaign, the aid agenda pivoted yet again in a third way. This time, the thinking was that good governance and democracy was the prerequisite for economic growth. The focus now became elections, credible government institutions, respect for rule of law, clamping down on corruption, and these were all preconditions for aid assistance. This third wave notwithstanding, studies on the association between aid and democracy have been inconclusive. Some have found that aid does increase the likelihood of a democratic transition. Others have found no association at all. And others still have even found a negative correlation as aid to GDP ratios raise. So this last decade, and what I consider the fourth wave, has seen the rise of initiatives. So we're talking a little bit less about good governance and more broadly about initiatives such as the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. This is for funding prevention, care, and treatment of HIV/AIDS. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which provides additional aid to countries whose governments promote good governance, invest in people through education and healthcare, and promote open markets. The Women's Justice and Empowerment Initiative, which aims to strengthen African governments' capacity to effectively deal with gender violence. The Central African Regional Program for Environment, which supports environmental programs including the Congo Basin Forest. The Africa Education Initiative, which aims to increase quality of basic education, and so on and so forth. These initiatives reflect a range of ideas from good governance to economic development, to health care, to food security, global climate change. There are two problems with these initiatives. First, they lack a comprehensive overarching plan. And second, and I think more importantly, is weak implementation on the ground. Let me give you an example of PEPFAR. I'm sure most of you have heard about PEPFAR, and as I mentioned, it's the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And although PEPFAR has been lauded as a success, and I don't wish to take anything away from the significant difference that PEPFAR has made in the lives of many HIV/AIDS patients, and the life-saving therapies that it has enabled. But the truth is, if we measure it in terms of bang for the buck, much, much more should have been achieved. In the first cycle of PEPFAR, 2003 to 2008, 15 billion was directed at 15 PEPFAR countries. These countries were successful in the sense that they put 2.4 million people on antiretroviral therapies, which saved their lives. There were 11 million women who accessed prevention of mother-to-child transmission medication. And there was a lot of money that was spent also on prevention. But this kind of money should have been transformational to the whole health system on the ground. I worked on the ground with these programs, so this is my own personal experience and my own personal view. But if you look at the health statistics in Africa generally, there have been improvements, but not much, and they're not very statistically significant if you compare PEPFAR countries as against non-PEPFAR countries. Failures of the various aid agenda is now exacerbated by two other changes that are happening on the ground. First, there's been a commodity boom in many African countries, and this means that aid forms a smaller part of national budgets. As an example, in my country, Zambia, only 4.6% of the national budget will be derived from aid in 2013. That's $288 million. Secondly, and more importantly, China has become the biggest investor in Africa. Its investments dwarf the aid budget by orders of magnitude. Compare the US dollar 208 million combined, mind you, so this includes other aid donors, to the $2.4 billion that China has invested in Zambia in 2012-2013. African governments are looking at China and resuscitating old ideas about state-run economies. They are also diminishing the importance of democracy. These governments are no longer incentivized by aid to support democratic institutions. And whatever fragile institutions have been established over the last 60-odd years with aid are now being diminished without restraint, diminished and undermined without restraint. If America is to take on China in Africa, it's unlikely that it will match China dollar for dollar in investment, and I don't think that it needs to. It can wield a tremendous influence, but it needs to change its approach, a fifth wave, if you will. And it's focused on doing a few things, but doing them well. Research has shown that the only way to have sustainable democracy is through the development of the middle class. This research shows that GDP per capita of $6,000 pretty much guarantees a reasonably stable democracy. It's not to say it's easy, but if the goal is to establish democracies across Africa, this requires a long-term commitment to economic development. Some of these ideas I'm sure you've heard before, but it's important to promote American investment in Africa and to support trade in meaningful ways. Africa's global share of trade is only about 1% and attracts only about 5% of global foreign direct investment. So there's tremendous scope for growth. It's not to say that there haven't been initiatives in this direction. There's the US Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, which was devised to open up American markets to African goods. But if you look under the hood, in reality, 80% of those imports are petroleum products. And there are caps on important items such as textiles from Africa, which could really make a difference in economic growth. What's needed is proper implementation. And this, by the way, will be good for America too. Second, I think we all need to get strategic and serious about supporting good governance and democracy. Right now, we really need adequate and comprehensive support for democratic institutions. And this means not shying away from the domestic affairs of countries. What we've seen so far is really cosmetic or window dressing, mainly around election support. And this can even be used to legitimize authoritarian leaders. There are regular elections in Zimbabwe. There are regular elections in Uganda, regular elections in Rwanda and in Angola, but they are not free and they're not fair. It means comprehensive support for institutions that can provide meaningful checks and balances on the executive. Free press, meaningful support of independent judiciaries, support for reformers and oppositions within the legislature. Otherwise, they easily get suppressed or sometimes co-opted. Finally, supporting social programs, which are important, because it's not an area that will be supported through any other means. I think that it's quite clear that the Chinese, and they've said as much, they don't have any interest in social programs. Trade, not aid, although I fundamentally agree with some of the ideas there, will also not provide a solution for social programs. However, these programs need to be implemented in ways that make sure that the money gets to the ground and they're not drained by US government agencies, US NGOs, US consultants, and staff leaving cents on the dollar, a few cents on the dollar, for actual implementation. These programs should be transformational or revolutionary, and right now, even PEPFAR, which is arguably one of the most successful initiatives, is not. The response by America to the rise of China and Africa seems to be a war of words rather than actions. In 2001, the then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and this meeting was in Zambia, asked Africans to beware of new colonialism, and that during the colonial era, it was easy to come in, take out natural resources, pay off leaders, and leave. She did not mention China, but I think it was clear to everybody present that that was who she meant. I think America may well lose its #1 position economically. Predictions are that this could happen around the year 2020, depending on who you ask and what assumptions you use, but at present growth rates, that sounds about right. I believe, however, that America can retain its influence politically and ideologically, and it doesn't need to do more. It needs to do better. I believe in free markets and liberal economies, liberal democracies as the best model for long-term growth, prosperity, stability, and I believe that the average African would choose the same, given the option. So I ask everybody here to try in their own way, small or big, as policymakers or future policymakers, as some of you students will be, business owners, voters, aid workers, to do our best to ensure that this option is not closed to African citizenry. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Iris. That's a pretty bleak picture you've just painted of the U.S. Role and future in Africa. You said we don't have to do more, but we have to do better. Yes. And you pointed out that out of $15 billion which were poured into an AIDS prevention or rehabilitation program, only a few cents on the dollar reached the people on the ground. Mm-hmm. And then you said, but don't pay that money to American contractors, American consultants, and maybe even Americans working on the ground in Africa pay it to somebody else. To me, that seems a little inconsistent, or maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, I
How
think
can we do better?
I think it's a misunderstanding, because I'm not saying don't pay any of these fine people, myself included, by the way. I was paid by the US government. What I'm saying is ensure that the majority of the money goes to the program. There's a lot of, I think, and you know, maybe I shouldn't be naming names, but I think just the way the structure is organized is that it goes from one government agency, splits to other government agencies, then gets split down to grantees and then sub-grantees, and everybody takes money for administration and what they call technical assistance. But really, if the actual operators on the ground are the sub-grantees, there's really nothing that is being done, very little that's being done administratively or in terms of technical assistance, yet that money is taken away from the program. So maybe I overstated it, but what I meant to say is that and I think a lot of people support programs like PEPFAR because they believe that it is doing good, and it is doing good, but I think it could do better if more of the money actually reached the ground. Are we living in a world where we feel good doing what we're doing, but we could feel better if the same amount we were spending were better spent? I think so. I mean, wouldn't it be better if instead of 2.4 million people were on antiretrovirals, 10 million people were on antiretrovirals? I mean, it's a personal thing. I don't know how cognizant people are of the actual numbers and the data, but I think it's important to pay attention, to say, look, I, as the American taxpayer, it's my money, and I want to know what it's used for. And it's not a debate that is only had with international NGOs. I think domestic NGOs as well. You want to know, when you give $1, how much of that is going to be spent on other things. If I give you $1 and you're saying you spend 90 cents of it, on having a nice office in Washington and having, happy, well-paid consultants, I might be less inclined to give you my money. If you say, you reverse it and say we spend 10 cents on administration and 90% of the money goes to actual implementation, it changes things very dramatically, and I think people would like to know that. I think it's fair.
Presumably you're aware that here in the United States, for many decades now, Americans believe that they are spending more money in Africa and other places abroad than they actually are. The amount of money Americans spend is less than 10 or 11 cents out of every dollar on foreign aid. And so I'm trying to get at your argument to Americans is, we don't want you to spend more than that 11 cents. I don't think any more money is needed. I think it just needs to be applied effectively and efficiently. And I think if people knew, I think they would demand more money goes to the actual intended recipients. Because if I talk to you about PEPFAR, you are going, and I say 15 billion in 15 countries, that is an opportunity to totally transform. I mean, Zambia has a population, depending on who you ask, 12, 13 million. If you put $1 billion into the health sector, you're not just talking about transformation for HIV/AIDS, you're talking about the whole health sector, the whole health system being revamped. And that's what I would have liked to see, because the money was there. Now, you mentioned in your remarks, and I mentioned in my introduction as well, the governments in Africa, including in Zambia, as being part of the problem. But if you had to apportion blame, how would you apportion it? If the US found a way to get more of its tax dollar to the people on the ground like you who were working in an HIV/AIDS program, how much of that would be peeled off by the Zambian government?
That's actually a very interesting and current question, because there's been a big push by many African governments that the money come directly to the government, as opposed to being channeled to NGOs. The argument is the government should be responsible for health. But the concern is that if you funnel the money to the government, you will get worse results than if you funnel it to NGOs, because it's very easy for the US government to hold an NGO accountable. Bit more tricky, bit more difficult for the US government to hold another government responsible for the finances in the same way.
What do you think?
I mean, it's a difficult question because, of course, health should be run by the government. But I think until they merit and they show their capacity and seriousness and issues of corruption are dealt with, I think it's going to be a bigger problem. So long-term sustainability, in an ideal world, it should be the government. In fact, the government should be focusing on HIV/AIDS and other health issues without the help of the US government. That should be there. We have a situation in Zambia where you have 1 in 5 people who are HIV positive. I mean, this is a pandemic. You would think that the Zambian government would put this front and center, as opposed to almost abdicating their role and giving it to sort of the US taxpayer. It's not to say that the Zambian government doesn't put money into health and they don't have other priorities, they do, but very broadly, I think HIV/AIDS treatment has been financed by PEPFAR.
Playing devil's advocate, though, if I'm the Zambian government and I see the US pouring $15 billion into my region, I would say, you know what? I don't have to worry about that problem. The US is taking care of it. It's almost a disincentive for the local governments to step up and deal with the problems. Do you agree with that, or?
Yes, I do agree with that. However, if I were in government, what I'd be really concerned about is what happens if PEPFAR funding is reduced. And this is a reality. What happens, I mean, it's very likely down the road that the US government will, I mean, they're making budget cuts left, right, and center. There's a lot of issues and problems in the US economy. So it's likely that down the road, PEPFAR funding will be reduced, cut, and the program could actually end. So I think it is imperative for governments, not just the Zambian government, but all the countries that are receiving this money, to come up with a plan of their own to take over, and it could be over a period of time, and come up and think about sustainability over the long term. Right now, I have not seen that.
I want to ask you about a couple of things that you actually spent only a little time on, and in one case didn't mention at all in your remarks, but I think it will be an interesting topic here tonight. You did talk about China and China's role in Africa. What does China want in Zambia? I don't think you mentioned that.
They want copper.
Copper.
They want copper. I think I was being a little bit strategic because I thought that, and I hope there will be quite a few questions around some of the ideas that I've thrown out at you. But China, I think, has been almost the opposite to the US in their approach. They are not coming from a donor point of view. They are coming from a point of view of wanting to secure commodities for themselves in the long term. So their investment in Zambia is very, very clearly about commodities, and that's all. They're not interested in aid, they're not interested, not surprisingly, in democracy or building democratic institutions. It's very commercial, and it's very cut and dried.
You're not suggesting, though, that the US doesn't have similar motives in places like Nigeria, where the US extracts a lot of oil, and other places where the US extracts other minerals and diamonds and so on, are you?
No, I'm not suggesting that at all, but I think you have this combination, and what I've been talking about primarily is aid, where you have foreign direct investment. It's true, America's investment in Africa in general has also been in the commodities area, but you don't, I think, when you're talking about bilateral government-to-government donations, it's quite a different discussion. China, I think, doesn't pretend to dabble in that space. they are talking really strictly about commercial agreements. And some people agree with that, that that's actually the way it should be done. If you have something that somebody wants to buy, let them buy it, and there shouldn't be any conditionalities attached. There shouldn't be any strings attached to that. It's just a pure commercial arrangement. You get money, they get what they want, and everybody goes home at the end of the day.
Does everybody in Zambia go home at the end of the day? Do the people of Zambia benefit from those kinds of transactions?
Yes, in the sense of employment. I mean, if you have new mines or mines expanding, there's employment, and of course the government gets, if there aren't tax breaks, the government gets taxation. So there, there is a benefit, but it's an indirect benefit. And as I mentioned in my remarks, there are certain things where you're talking about social programs. And another thing which I find very worrying is that now the democratic ideal is being watered down. I think probably 10 years ago, a lot of the Zambian government itself always talked about democracy building, trying to support democratic institutions, and they talked a lot about human rights. Now I think there's kind of a new discussion going on, fundamentally around economics and whether the state-centric economic model might be better. It's worked for China, so it might work for Zambia too. But with that, you also start to see a change in the language and the idea of how important democracy is in the whole equation. People are now talking about sequencing. Maybe we focus on the economy, and then when we get to a certain point, then we can start talking about democratic institutions and democracy.
That sounds a lot like China.
Well, this is why. That's why I'm saying that even though China, I don't believe, has an ideological agenda, just by example, now I think the discussion, things that we have not heard about, ideas about nationalization of private entities, we haven't heard that discussion in 30 years, and now all of a sudden it's back on the table, and that makes me very concerned that that's the beginning of lots of other discussions which will erode some of the institutions that have been built. And as I mentioned, I think these institutions are still fragile. They need time to marinate and really become part of the sort of the fabric of society, so that we can't imagine, just as in the US, you can't imagine a judiciary that's compromised. You can't imagine muzzling the press. It's just not possible. Whereas these things are very possible where you have these very, very powerful executives.
When you come to the United States, as you're here now, and you talk to Americans about your views of how aid should be continued to Africa and how it might be reshaped and so on, do you think Americans, like the people in this room, have a right to expect that the democratic agenda coincide with the aid agenda, or do you think Americans should keep those two things separate?
I think that they have been so aligned in the American history that, and I think it's worked well in this country. And so for me, and you'll find this funny, but some of my friends in Zambia call me a Yank, which is incredible to me, but anyway. But obviously I have been influenced by going to law school here and studying international relations here, but I don't think I'm so influenced that I am blinded and it's not a thoughtful approach. So I really think that if you have a liberal economy and democracy, in the long term, you have a better society, you have stability. And I think that's important, obviously for the domestic situation, but it's also important for global peace and stability. Where you don't have these things, you have, we're seeing in Somalia and countries like that, terrorism arising. There's opportunities for young, jobless, uneducated individuals to channel their energy in very negative ways. So I think it's very important in the long run. My concern is that governments tend to think more short term, and I think short term it's appealing because You know, these things are difficult to build, they're time consuming, they can be expensive. And if you're in the executive, you just want to do what you need to do as quickly as possible. You don't want to be bothered necessarily with pesky legislators and even worse, a judiciary that's hampering what you're trying to do. So I think there's always a tension in every society, but I think it's very important and worthwhile that these two ideals continue to be pushed. And this is why I think that, you know, some of the statements that maybe former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had made have done a disservice, because instead of promoting what's good about the American ideal, it's more about China bashing, which, by the way, I don't think works very well. There have been some Pew surveys which have asked questions about attitudes towards China, attitudes towards America. And actually, they're both favorable in many African countries. They're like, the Chinese are good and the Americans are good. So.
You didn't mention in your talk, and I'd like you to tell our audience a little bit about the business you're engaged in, because it touches on the whole question of the prospects for development in a country like yours, or like many others actually in sub-Saharan Africa. Your business is a telephone business, but it's a commerce business. What is it that your company does? Why is it necessary to do that in Zambia and in other countries? And what do you think it's going to produce for the people of Zambia?
So I think very big picture, I believe that...
What's the name of your company first?
It's called Mobile Payment Solutions. And big picture, I think it's going to be the private sector that is going to be Africa's salvation. It sounds a bit dramatic, but I really believe that it is the private sector which is going to provide employment, which is going to help build the middle class, and the middle class is going to help with cementing democratic institutions. So what we do, and sort of with that philosophy, and having spent quite a lot of time in the public sector, and maybe being slightly frustrated with some of the things that I saw, I thought that, you know, I need to sort of put my money where my mouth was and start doing things in the private sector, but I still want to do something which I believed would be transformational. And so what we do is, I don't know if any of you have been to Kenya, but we took the Kenyan model, which is a company called Safaricom, and they've really transformed the Kenyan economy. Now you have about 11% of GDP going through cell phones. Now, it doesn't sound very dramatic in this context, because here most people have bank accounts, most people have credit cards. But in Zambia, as an example, only 15% of the whole population have bank accounts at all. So they don't have any access to financial services or products. The mobile phone, the technology is already there. Almost everybody, at least half the population, more than half the population, have a mobile phone. Means that the technology is already in people's hands, in people's pockets, in people's handbags. So what we wanted to do was harness the technology that was already there and turn this little phone into essentially a mobile or an electronic wallet. And with that, people can do transactions. They can save money on it. They can send money to each other. They can pay for things. And they can get paid. So even, I mean, the government has not yet, I think they're talking about it, but they've not yet fully embraced it. But it's so much more efficient for government to make payments, social payments, cash transfers, some of the programs that they are running out there. We're doing a program with, it's actually a US-funded NGO called ABT, where we are helping them pay malaria sprayers all over the country. So they have 1,000 individuals that they need to pay every 2 weeks. And we work with them and we make sure the payments go out. It just comes up as an SMS on the mobile phone, and the sprayer is able to go to their neighborhood agent and cash out. So now, instead of the NGO having to schlep, you know, thousands of kwacha in their car across the country, which takes time, it's not safe, it's not efficient, we can do this in real time over the phone.
And it's a trusted technology that people in areas, it's trusted because they already have the phone, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think part of it is it's trusted because they have a phone, and the second thing is, particularly if I send you money, you're going to check, right? So you have, it verifies itself and it proves itself. So what we find is that once somebody has used it once, then they're very happy and excited. When you tell them about it, there's been a bit of skepticism, but you know, we can literally show them and say, okay, where's your phone? What's your phone number? Here's the money, go and cash out over there. And once they do that, then I think the skeptics are satisfied and they get real money in their hands. And in Kenya, in fact, they've been at this game a bit longer. People don't even bother to cash out. They just keep the money in the electronic form on their phone, which is really an ideal because now everybody uses M-Pesa. You'd never need to cash out. Your grocer, your friends, you know, you can get money from your parents, you can pay your school fees, whatever you want to do, you can do on M-Pesa. So the need for cash is almost, it becomes almost irrelevant, which is ideal, which is what we want to do. If that happens in Zambia, then I'll be making a lot of money, which will be, which will be a good thing. If it doesn't, then I'm totally, can I say screwed? Yeah.
No, you can't say that. All right, we're coming to your questions. Just want to last follow up on this subject. Putting your company's business in the context of our earlier conversation, who's making the money on that? Are Zambians making the money on that? How much of it is going to the people on the ground? How much of it is getting peeled off by the government, if any?
Which conversation?
The conversation we just had a few minutes ago about aid funds, which are being transferred. Now you've got a business running there. Mm-hmm. Does the government get a cut every time you do a transaction? Who's getting the profit on that? You indicated already that you're going to be a rich woman, but aside from you.
One day, one day. I mean, the government will get its cut in the sense of taxes, but they don't, it's a purely private company, so they don't participate in that. But the nice thing about it is along the chain, I mean, the agent who cashes out gets a commission, he gets money. The malaria sprayer, in this case, doesn't have to travel very far or doesn't have to wait days or weeks for his money or her money. They get it immediately. So I think in terms of efficiency and opportunity costs, there are some advantages there. And it's quite cheap. It's much, much cheaper than any other system, including the banking system, which charges high service fees.
I guess it's cheaper if they already have the phone.
Yes.
They've already invested in phone service and having the phone.
Yes, almost everybody has a phone. I mean, my father's eldest sister, who unfortunately passed away, but she was 97, she had a mobile phone, and she used it.
Did she use it for financial transactions?
No, she didn't, but indirectly, because she called when she lived in a rural area. So if she had any financial difficulties, then she would pick up her cell phone and call. So.
All right, I got to ask a stupid question before we go to the smart ones here. Stupid question is, if you can do this in Zambia, why can't I do it here?
You can do it here. You can do it here. I think the issue here is there are so many alternatives. I mean, you can use your credit card almost anywhere, or you can do internet banking. But I think that's the next best thing, the next big thing. I mean, companies like Google are investing in this kind of technology. And probably, I mean, this is sort of, you should ask the crowd how many people are using their mobile phones to make payments. But I was in Starbucks the other day and somebody used their mobile phone to buy their coffee. So I think it will be one option. I don't think it's going to transform the American economy or society in the same way, but I think it will be an option.
Do you think it could transform all of African, especially rural African society?
Oh, really? I've seen it. Honestly, in Kenya, it's been very, very transformational. It's a very big deal in Kenya, and I'm just hoping that it will pick up in other parts of the continent, because it just makes sense. I mean, it's so much cheaper, it's so much more efficient. And I mean, people say in Kenya, you can pay, I don't know anything you can't pay for. And there's M-Pesa agents. Every 5 steps is sort of the equivalent of maybe Starbucks or McDonald's. They're just everywhere.
Okay. Let's go to your questions. We'll alternate again tonight between questions from students and non-students. Let's start with a non-student tonight. How about? Yes, sir.
I have really 2 questions. One is, could the U.S. government go through the African Union and use them as their entree to the variety of countries that are in Africa? And the second question is, do the Chinese also support Mugabe and some of the other countries over there with their donations so they can get commodities? So are we finding that the Chinese are in the same spot as we are, supporting dictators? And I guess that.
Okay, 2 questions. Let's do the second one first. The question is asking whether, isn't China essentially in the same boat the United States is in, providing its funding, you said it wasn't aid, its investments to countries with dictatorial or authoritarian governments in the same way the U.S. has been?
I think the issue, to be fair to the Chinese, is they are not interested in domestic internal politics. They're interested in commodities. So to the extent that the one is not going to hurt the other, they are quite happy. And they are in Zimbabwe, because there's diamonds in Zimbabwe, and they are in Zambia. So I think for them, it's a different equation. I don't think they look at that as a big factor, except from a very commercial perspective to say, look, is our asset going to be safe in this country? So I think the equation is there. I don't think they put on the second layer of concerning themselves about what kind of regime they are investing in. They're investing in commodities, and where it is not that important or relevant.
And does the U.S. concern itself with that layer?
Yes, I think much more so. I think even in terms of foreign direct investment, I think most American investors will be more comfortable investing in countries that they consider democratic, maybe from a commercial point of view, but I think also in terms of sensibility. There's some more concern and more discussion about that. Not all companies, but I think, and there are some companies that are investing in, purely authoritarian regime because they want to get whatever asset is in that particular country. So it's not to say that, American business is pure as the driven snow. I think we know it's not. But I think the concerns are a bit broader. I think the government here also sometimes regulates and makes sure that companies cannot go into certain countries, or that there's a penalty. Public opinion, I think, is also quite powerful in America. If you are considered a company investing in places and doing bad things, that can actually hurt your share price, which is something that all companies are concerned about.
The questioner's other question was about, and I'm extrapolating just a bit here, I'm not sure I exactly understood, but I think the question was about your complaint about the amount of aid that doesn't reach the people, and he's suggesting why not send that aid through the African Union. What would your view be of that? Well, let's see.
Yeah, well, the African Union has its own share of problems, and that's putting things as diplomatically as I possibly can. So, I mean, the African Union is not really designed to receive, it's not designed at all for this kind of thing. And I think because it has so many of its own problems in terms of being effective and even being an important player on the continent, again, there's a lot of gestures with the African Union, but whichever area you're looking at, even if you're talking about peace and security, they have not been able to effectively provide either troops or resources. So I don't see the African Union as a solution to improvements in aid. I think it would be akin to adding another level of bureaucracy to the levels that already exist.
Another layer of people to peel off some more, money.
Yes, exactly.
But seriously, is there another African-based organization, private or public, that you see as potentially being useful for assisting in getting more of the aid directly to the people who work with it on the ground? Or is there really no option?
Well, I mean, you know, I think that working with NGOs directly is not a bad thing. I would actually argue that there's a role for the private sector. If you look at companies like Coca-Cola, you can go anywhere. I'm sure you've traveled extensively. You can usually find a Coke in some very remote places, which means that the private sector has figured out a way to distribute this product cost effectively. So why not use or harness that capacity to distribute medicine or to distribute other things? So I think so far, I mean, they talk a lot about private-public partnerships, but I don't think there's been a lot of creativity, and I don't think there's been sufficient utilization of the abilities that are out there. I don't see why not. How would be complicated, but I think it could be worked out.
All right, question from a student? Yes, sir.
Hi, I was wondering, China's been investing heavily in Africa, and I'm guessing, I don't know the numbers, but I'm guessing that's increased the GDP per capita of the African people quite significantly. So I'm wondering, wouldn't that lead to an increase of the middle class, and would that maybe indirectly lead to democracy, even though that's not China's goal? Just wondering your thoughts.
Okay, you talked earlier about the importance of the middle class in Africa, and the questioner is asking whether China's aid to or investments in Africa won't themselves lead to an improvement and development of a middle class in Africa, which the questioner suggests might actually lead to democratic movements.
I think it's an interesting idea, and it could happen in the very long term. I think in the short term, one of the problems is if you are investing in mining, what you're doing is job creation, but it tends to be lower level jobs. You're hiring primarily miners, and they tend, at least in many African countries, tends to be lower income. And so its capacity, if the mines are big enough and generating enough profit, theoretically, in terms of taxation, that would be the way in which the government benefits through this additional revenue. And you are seeing that there is an increase overall in the revenues in these countries. However, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, because if you don't have a good government, then you don't have good application of the money that you do get via taxes. So directly, I mean, they will have an impact in that they'll, hire a few thousand miners. Indirectly through taxation, potentially, but you do need to have these good government institutions to spend the money appropriately.
Iris, I mentioned to you that we simulcast this program on the internet through something called Second Life, and we have a questioner in Scotland who is asking about your views of China, and I think he doesn't say so, Derek doesn't say so, but is asking whether you as a Zambian would prefer to see, and maybe try to project for us the views of other Zambians that you are aware of, whether Zambians would prefer to see China be a more dominant power in Africa and perhaps elsewhere in the world than the US is.
I don't think that I think it's a good question, and it's an interesting question. I think being in Zambia, and when I'm there, I actually don't care that much where the investment comes from. I would be happy if it came from Scotland or from England or from the US or from China. I think some of the issues that have come up with, and in Zambia, there have been some sort of pretty dramatic clashes between Chinese and Zambians. In one mine, there was an incident where the miners were agitating for increased salaries, and I think one of the Chinese managers shot at some of the Zambian miners. I mean, they were arrested and they were dealt with, but definitely there have been sort of clashes along the way, and I think the issue again is the requirement for government to make sure that, you know, workers' rights are respected, people get, you know, adequate salaries, minimum wage is respected, working hours, and the like. And I think that...
Would you expect China to demand those sorts of things?
Well, China's not demanding that in China, so I think it's very unrealistic. It's unrealistic that they're going to change and do business in a different way just because they happen to be running a mine in Zambia. Something has to make them do things differently, and I think that is the government's role to make sure. I mean, the laws are there.
The Zambian government's
yes,
role.
the Zambian government's role. The laws are there, they're in place, so it's an issue of enforcement. It is always, I think, the difficulty that sometimes the government has is like, wow, these guys are bringing in $2 billion. You know, that's a lot of money. And so how do we deal with, you know, and we need this money, by the way. So how do we deal diplomatically, yet forcefully, and ensure that, you know, the rules apply across the board? And this is not just about Chinese companies. I think it's about every company that is operating in this country. I mean, in these countries, the profit imperative can make companies do bad things sometimes. Here in America too, it's not unique to Africa. So I think it's very important for government to make sure Zambian companies comply with the law, Chinese companies comply with the law, American companies comply with the law, whoever is there. And I think the enforcement of the laws has been very weak.
I'm a little surprised to hear you say that you don't really care where the money comes from, just send money.
From an investment point of view, I think the average, you said the average Zambian, what they would think, what they would want for economic development. I don't think they're really thinking that hard about where it comes in. What I would be concerned about is jobs. I want a job, actually.
Okay. And so if you told that to an American audience, what do you think that would do to American support for aid?
Well, I mean, we have an American audience, so we should probably ask them.
Okay. All right, let's take a question from a non-student. Yes, sir. Are you?
The impression that I get from your presentation is sort of like more aid or making it more effective. I'm somewhat surprised, like after all these years, that you think aid could be provided better. Isn't that aid by itself as this way of creating all these loopholes around it or people trying to get out of it? So there was all this criticism about aid, and I'm just thinking whether the way for it is sort of like stay or keep African is through having more trade, opening the trade route, creating a means where US investors would know the opportunities that are in Africa, rather than trying to make the aid mechanism more effective or providing more aid.
Okay, I think we got the question, which is basically the trade versus aid question. The questioner is essentially saying, you seem to be arguing that it's important to find better ways to make aid more efficient, and he's saying, why not put our efforts and our money and so on into improving trade relations, which would benefit businesses and business owners and business employees in Zambia and other African countries.
Well, I don't, and you know, forgive me if I gave the impression that it's an either-or proposition in my mind. I don't think it is. I think trade is very important. Foreign direct investment is very important. And as I mentioned, I think that the private sector is really going to be the answer and the long-term solution. Having said that, and having worked in social programs, it's going to be a tricky proposition to get private investors interested in primary education in African countries, or HIV, AIDS, healthcare in African countries, because how you make those things commercially viable is very difficult, and the need is immediate and now. So, I mean, I'm a proponent of both, and it's interesting that you asked that question, because my best friend from childhood is Dambisa Moyo, and she's very anti-aid. And, you know, we have these raging arguments up and down about, you know, whether aid can be fixed. And just like you, she believes it's part of the problem, whereas I believe that there are some interventions that can be done that can make aid more effective. And part of it is really getting people to know and understand. Well, I mean, one of the ways is kind of how the money flows and how the money is utilized, and to hold, you know, the American government accountable for some of the progress, for some of the lack of progress in some of these programs. And it's very interesting if you look at the USAID website, because everything is fantastic. You know, all the programs are wonderful, and they've done all these great things, and they honestly have. But I just think that with a little bit more thought, a little bit more care, a little bit more efficiency and effectively, they could do so much more. They could do so much more.
I'm trying to think of a website promoting a product that doesn't say everything is wonderful. Is there a question from a student? Question from a student. Yes, ma'am.
In your fifth wave of U.S. aid, you described that we should focus on good governance. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Is that the idea of international aid with strings attached, or is that the idea of pushing certain policies on like the international realm in terms of like through UN action, or whether or not we should exert our influence on through international bodies?
Okay, question is about your idea that the United States should try to do more about good governance, and the questioner is asking whether you think that ought to be done through direct strings attached to U.S. aid going to a country like Zambia, or should aid be funneled through some UN body or some other international regulatory organization that would attach the strings?
Okay, so...
And she didn't mention the World Bank and
Yeah.
IMF, but I imagine you will in your answer, and you might want to include that.
Yes, I mean, generally, I think in terms of what has been done in the past, and I think probably to the gentleman's point, is donors have not been very effective in terms of trying to build lasting democratic institutions. I think the language has always been there. They talk about human rights, they talk about democracy, but I think the interventions have not been designed in a way that they can be effective. If you talk about funneling it through the UN or any other agencies, it's really the same type of discussion, because you're just too far away. You're in New York, or you're in Washington, or you're in Geneva, and what's happening on the ground is something that can be fluid and can be, you know, a little bit difficult to get a handle on, because what you're looking at is going to be data, and you're writing reports. And I worked for the World Bank, so I mean, they'll never hire me again for saying this, but you spend a lot of time writing reports. So, you know, you're not quite a million miles away, but you're quite far removed from what's happening on the ground. What I'm proposing, and what a lot of these international organizations can't even do because of their mandates, which are not to get too involved in the domestic affairs of member countries or recipient countries, is to really go and directly support the free press, directly support opposition, I mean, I don't know if this can ever happen, but I think that this is, if we're really going to talk about results on the ground, these are the types of interventions that need to happen. So it would be a USAID giving money. Of course, it would be very controversial, but to opposition parties, or at least have some sort of a fund where they can tap into, to use for maybe some general things around elections. I mean, they could put some conditionalities around how it would work. But I think that right now what they do is much more window dressing. Oh, we're going to pay for whatever, 100 election monitors to come. The election monitors come, but meanwhile, this thing has been already rigged and planned and organized, and people have been oppressed and all of this type of thing. 6 months before an election monitor is even on the ground. So, you know, if we're really going to do some transformational things, I think we need to change the way we think about it, or stop talking about it and not talk about how we're going to be pro-democracy and how we're building democratic institutions. Because, I mean, given the amount of money, again, that has gone into aid, you know, it's staggering amounts of money. And when we look at what we have to show for it on the ground, it's very little. And particularly when you talk about these institutions, they're very, very fragile, and they're so easily overwhelmed by the executive.
So you don't think there is an international organization, the UN Development Program, for example, you would not...
Let's just say if the World Bank is here, Zambia is here, my view of the UN system is sort of further away as opposed to closer to being able to provide answers.
Okay. Question from a non-student. Yes, ma'am.
What about imitating your business model in the mobile phone to distribute the aid, taking this idea and cut on agencies and bureaucracies?
Okay, questioner is saying, why not use your model for financial transactions on mobile devices and use it to distribute aid?
Well, I mean, actually, we could if we were given the money to distribute it. I think we could.
Skipping the middleman, I think, was her point.
Yeah, I mean, it would be fantastic, but I don't think I'm going to get a call tomorrow from USAID and say, you know, we've got X million dollars for you to distribute. But it could happen, and I think in the future, I mean, sure, there would have to be some constraints around it to make sure I don't, you know, jump on a plane and hightail to, you know, Tahiti or something like that. But, you know, I think...
well, wait a minute. That's not quite fair. Your system, you don't have the money.
No, actually the money is in...
Nobody's giving you...
No,
right.
it's in
the
bank accounts.
The money belongs to somebody else,
yes,
and they transfer it through your system.
I'm just joking,
okay.
And I'm being facetious, but I think there will be a day, and right now we've been lobbying the Zambian government, actually, to use the system to distribute various types of payments. I think sometimes there is resistance, because once you take cash out of the system, you take away opportunities for, you know, as they call it, rent seeking. You can't do a lot with the cash. I mean, you don't have the cash anymore. And also with electronics, there is a trace on every transaction that's happened. So I think there are some quarters in the government that are very excited about this, particularly at the higher levels. There are other quarters who are very resistant, because I think they're concerned about a good chunk of their income disappearing.
All right, we have another question from Second Life from an educator in Pennsylvania who wants to come back to the, the educator's talking about oil, but I think any kind of commodity product like copper in Zambia would fill the bill. And the question is, what happens in a country like Zambia or with copper, or Nigeria with oil, when the commodity runs out or the price of the commodity declines sufficiently that it's no longer the source of income, or the extent of the source of income that the government had been accustomed to? What
yeah.
effect will that have on countries in Africa?
Well, we've seen it actually, because historically the prices do go up and they do go down. And what happens is mines close, jobs are lost, the tax income goes down. I mean, it's quite, especially in countries where you're highly dependent on commodities and commodity prices. When the prices are high, have they been in the last few years, it's fantastic, for the government. They actually have some money, and as I discussed earlier, the requirement to depend on donors goes down significantly, but that is easily reversed as well. And we have seen that before in Zambia more than once, where the copper prices are so depressed that it's not worth mining anymore, and a lot of the mines close.
I want to relate that question, though, to one of your comments in your opening remarks when, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you basically said the U.S. buys oil but doesn't buy textiles, and if the U.S. bought textiles from African countries, it would actually help more ordinary people on the ground in Africa. If the commodity prices decline, would you imagine developed countries like the U.S. and other rich countries saying, okay, never mind, we don't need to buy oil from you anymore, but we still want to help, we're going to start buying textiles? Or do you think it's really all about providing the commodity that the rich country wants and needs?
Well, I think the example that I used of AGOA was an example of how ostensibly it's a great initiative, because you're talking about promoting, increasing trade between Africa and America. The problem is that when you start looking at what's happening and you sort of go in detail, what you see is that, I mean, the U.S. has its own interests, and I think, maintaining subsidies in the U.S. is a big deal, and it's not going to be removed by AGOA, and so AGOA will have to respect and work within the constraints of the subsidies that exist, some of the protection that exists. I mean, if you allow cheap goods from Africa to flood into America, you might have a situation where American jobs are lost, or and that's, you don't want to help Zambia and hurt yourself. You need to have a win-win situation, and I think this is why some of these initiatives are framed the way they are. So, of course, countries have to have their self-interest, and I think that's fair. It's fair, and it's expected. I think the example was more to show that some of these great initiatives sort of fall apart in the details in terms of how they really are supposed to impact the average, guy on the street in these countries.
Okay, let's get a question from a student. Is there a question from a student? Yes, sir?
My question is more likely on the other part of this tonight's discussion, that is the rest of the developing world. I belong to Pakistan, and I've seen a lot of aid money coming to Pakistan.
Yeah.
One of the reports at Harvard Belfast Center reports that it's a title of that report that U.S. taxpayers are funding corruption in Pakistan. So it's a very interesting thing that a lot of these friends of mine, U.S. citizens, they are giving a lot of their funds, a lot of their money to developing world, and in response, there's nothing happening on ground. I think there is a problem with the need assessment. Like the way we think they are like global initiative for these 10, 15 things. As compared to what goes on ground, people have different needs. So my question is to you, as you are dealing with the technology, that is there a need of bringing a technology to these developing world, and actually we need a technology transfer rather than technology replacement to these developing countries in terms of with this aid?
Okay, I'm going to try to paraphrase it succinctly. Questioner identifies himself as being associated with Pakistan and points out that he read a report from Harvard that said U.S. taxpayers are whose headline was U.S. taxpayers are funding corruption in Pakistan. And his basic question is whether it might be more useful to transfer technology to developing countries rather than transferring services or aid money to developing countries and let those countries use the technology to develop their own economies. I think I've paraphrased it okay. All right.
That's a tough question. I think it would depend. I mean, I think it could be an interesting model. I'm trying to think of some examples.
Well, let's ask about Zambia
Yeah.
for just a second. If you said to a local business operator in Zambia, we're going to show you, we're going to sell you the technology that your company, Mobile Payments, has created. We're going to sell it to you in Zambia, let you run this system, and we're stepping out of it. We're just transferring the technology. I can't imagine that would be of any interest to you. You wouldn't want to give it away, right? But stepping aside from
Yeah.
your personal interest in the company, would it be better for Zambia if a local company had the technology and then could implement it in the way that would be perhaps best perceived on the ground?
Yeah, I think it could work. I'd have to think about it carefully as to what examples work and what examples would not work. I'm trying to think about, in more social sectors, how that could be applied. But there are some interesting ideas in the education sector where, some issues have to be addressed in terms of electricity and computers, but they're talking about, because there's such a shortage of teachers, developing sort of educational modules and letting computers teach the students, and then they can go at their own pace, and it doesn't matter whether your teacher shows up or not, and if you're a bright student you can be advanced. And some of the issues. So I think there's some, I think that innovation is going to be very important and crucial to changing how things are done on the ground. So, and I haven't been to Pakistan actually, but I would be quite interested to go, because I know Pakistan and in Asia in general, there has been quite a lot of innovation on the technology side, and I think there's a lot of learning that could be shared across there. But I think, these are kind of the ideas. I know with CIDRZ, there's a cervical cancer care and treatment program, prevention care and treatment program. That again uses technology, because they send photos, digital photos of the cervix from remote clinics to the doctors who tend to be in Lusaka, and they're able to look at it and help. Usually they have nurses out there, or sometimes even lesser trained, what they call clinical officers, out in rural parts, and they help them with diagnosis and treatment and what they should do. So I think that technology might well be a big part of the puzzle of how we solve this kind of development conundrum that we've so far failed to solve, and innovation and good ideas.
Putting on my devil's advocate hat for just a second in connection with this question, I could easily see Americans saying, wait a minute, we're not going to transfer sophisticated technology to Pakistan for the purpose of topic A, HIV, AIDS, or education or whatever, because they'll only use that technology to do something bad. They'll take advantage of that technology and turn it into something bad. I could see that argument being made. Couldn't that also be made, the same argument be made in Africa, that you might transfer the technology for one purpose, but it be used for another one? I would even think maybe the local government might not be in favor of that.
Yeah, I think that's always possible. And, it's interesting, because I have a lot of Nigerian friends, and they're, now because I'm sort of more in the financial sector, fraud is a huge concern. And I'm just like, you have these brilliant people who manage to be ahead of the game, the most sophisticated anti-fraud systems, and they're able to beat the system. So why not channel this obvious genius to something, positive, instead of trying to steal money, make money, because you have the capacity there. So, I think the innovation story is, I think we're at the beginning, and I think there's a lot to see what will happen good But as you say, there is always the potential for taking something that was good and using it for nefarious purposes.
Okay, we'll take a last question from a non-student. Over on the side here. Yes, sir. Yes, please.
One of the things I haven't heard you mention is food. You've got China doing major investment in Africa for food. You've got our country sending companies over there to promote our food products. And some of the African countries obviously going down, Zimbabwe and a few of the others as far as availability. How does food play into the aid and agriculture?
Okay, question is basically, does food play a role in the whole picture of U.S. aid to Africa? And if so, what role does it play? Is there more the United States could do? Is that not an effective vehicle?
I think it's almost a two-pronged question, because I think obviously there are certain parts of Africa that have famine and they need food aid. I mean, that is just a fact. And whether it's done by bilateral donors like the US or UN-type agencies, the food needs to get there, and that's being done. And I think most people would argue that in emergency situations, food aid is necessary, and it's a good thing. I think this might, in the agricultural space, I think that might be an opportunity for transfer of technology. I mean, in many African countries, we don't have a shortage of land, and we don't have a shortage of water. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure, but also we could use, I mean, I think the American agricultural industry has a long history, and they've solved a lot of problems that we could use those solutions. So I think there's a lot that could be shared. I mean, when you think about Africa and you look at the size of the continent, and you look at it should have the capacity to feed itself many times over. And some countries do export food because they have they figured out the agricultural equation. So, but I think we could learn a lot. I mean, some of the ideas are quite controversial. I think we talk about genetically modified foods and things like that. And personally, I think they're delicious, but but I mean, it's controversial. I mean, I'm just joking, but where there have been some situations where you do have famine, and then the governments don't want genetically modified food, which it seems like in an emergency situation, the higher order debate should go away. But maybe they're right. I'm not an agriculturalist. I don't know what the impact of having this GMOs out there is going to be in the long term. But I think America has figured that part out. I'm not sure, but I think we could definitely learn a great deal from the agricultural industry.
Please, let's thank our speaker tonight, CIDRZ Mwanza, for coming to the University of Delaware. Thank you very much.